Well, as we've said, today is Communion Sunday. We get to enjoy the honor and the privilege of sharing in Holy Communion. So as we move into the second week of this sermon series, how do we do that? We're going to ask, or why do we do that, I should say? We're going to ask the question, why do we take communion? Well, in the narrow sense, we take communion because Jesus told us to. Now, that was not in Matthew's version of the Last Supper, which we read a little bit ago, but it is in Luke. Luke tells us that Jesus specifically says, do this in remembrance of me. And for some people, that's probably enough reason right there, and I'm not saying that it's not. After all, if Jesus tells us to do something, then probably a pretty good idea for us to do it, right? We don't necessarily need more of a reason than just because Jesus said so. But still, we would like to understand why it is that we're supposed to do this, because after all, because I said so is never really a reason that satisfies us very well, is it? Even when we were kids, if mom and dad said we had to do something and we asked why and they came back at us with because I said so, we were not very happy about it. We might have to accept it, but we did not like it very much. And it's important. I think it's important for us to know why. Because that's the only way communion really is going to be meaningful to us, if we know why. And you know, before I became a pastor, I have to admit communion was really not all that meaningful for me. I did it. I knew it was something we were supposed to do in church. I knew it was supposed to be something that was important, but I never really knew why. It was just something that we did. In fact, really the first time that communion became meaningful to me was when I became a pastor and became authorized to give it. That's when it really became meaningful for me. And the meaning it had for me the first time I gave communion was that I was totally unworthy to be doing something like this. I had no business doing it. Who did I think I was anyway? I hold up the bread and the juice and I say a few words and somehow something magical is supposed to happen because of that? Frankly, I felt like a complete fraud the first time I gave communion. Felt totally unworthy of it. And of course the fact is that I was. I was unworthy of giving communion. I still am. And each one of you is unworthy of taking it. If we had to be worthy to take communion, none of us would ever be able to. The disciples were not worthy of sharing that Last Supper with Jesus. And of course, too, the other thing is nothing really happens just because I hold up bread and juice and say a few words. I don't make anything happen. Whatever happens, happens because God makes it happen, not because of me. So what is communion all about? Why do we take it? Well, yes, to remember Jesus, of course, but there has to be more to it than just that, because we could remember Jesus without ever taking communion. In fact, a lot of people do. So while it is important that we remember Jesus, that cannot be the only reason. The thing is, what we remember when we take communion and remember Jesus, what we're really remembering is what Jesus did for us. Jesus literally did give up his body and his blood for us, for the forgiveness of our sins. Remember, the reason it's called the Last Supper is that it literally was the Last Supper that Jesus ate while he was on this earth. He went from this meal to the Garden of Gethsemane, where he was arrested. Eventually he'd be beaten and killed. The body and blood of Christ were given up for us. But in the context of communion, what does that mean exactly? When Jesus said of the bread, this is my body, and of the wine, this is my blood, how are we supposed to take that? Well, there are some denominations that take it literally. They believe that when Jesus said, this is my body and this is my blood, he meant exactly what he said. There are some denominations which believe that when we take communion, the elements we take actually transform so that we do literally eat Jesus' body and drink Jesus' blood. And other denominations believe it's just symbolic. They rely more on the do this in remembrance of me part. They say that all communion really does is help us remember the sacrifice that Jesus made for us. And as I said last week, it's not my intention to criticize another denomination in this sermon series. They have good reasons for believing what they do. But as United Methodists, between those two sides that I talked about, we take kind of a middle ground on it. We don't believe that the bread and the juice physically transform into the body and blood of Christ, so that Jesus somehow has a physical presence in those elements. We believe the bread remains bread and the juice remains juice, but yet we don't believe that this is just a symbolic thing either. We believe that while Jesus is not physically present in the bread and the juice, Jesus does have a spiritual presence in the bread and in the juice. And of course, as Christians, we believe a spiritual presence is every bit as important and every bit as meaningful as a physical presence. So how does that work exactly? Well, we don't really know, because a spiritual presence is not really something you can see or hear or taste or touch. A spiritual presence has to be felt. It's not something that comes into our minds because of logic. It's something that comes into our hearts out of love. John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, and other people as well, have called communion one of God's means of grace. In other words, communion is one of the ways in which God's grace, God's Spirit, comes into us. Not the only way, of course, but it is a very important way. It's one of the ways God uses. And we believe that each one of us, all of us, are in need of God's grace. And so we should take advantage of every chance we can to get God's grace to come into us, including taking communion. And because we believe that everyone is in need of God's grace, we make communion available to everyone. As I say pretty much every time I give communion, you don't have to be a member of this church to take communion with us. You don't have to be a member of any United Methodist church to take communion with us. You don't have to be a member of any church at all to take communion with us. All you need is a desire to have the grace of God come into your heart and into your life. If you have that desire, you're more than welcome to share in Holy Communion with us, to feel that spiritual presence, that grace of God that comes into our hearts when we take communion. I would never want to be in the position of having tried to deny the grace of God to anyone. So, if taking communion is that important, how come we only do it once a month? Why don't we do it every week if it's that important? Well, John Wesley would say that we should. John Wesley said that if he could, he would take communion every day. That shows the importance that Wesley placed on Holy Communion, how much he believed that we are all constantly in the need of God's grace. And there's nothing really in United Methodist rules that says how often we ought to take communion. It says we should take it. That's all it really says. There are denominations that offer Holy Communion every week. In fact, there are United Methodist churches in which Holy Communion is offered every week. Once a month seems to be kind of the tradition among United Methodist churches in this area. That's all it is. It's just a tradition. We could celebrate Holy Communion more often if we chose to. We could also celebrate it less often. I would not be in favor of that, but we could. It's not a rule that says it has to be once a month. It's just a tradition. And there are a few other things about communion I want to address. As many of you know, in the United Methodist Church, we use grape juice for communion instead of wine. Why do we do that? Well, it's because we recognize the danger of alcoholism. We would not want the taking of Holy Communion to cause someone to lose a battle with alcohol, nor would we want someone who is fighting that battle to feel like they could not take communion with us out of the fear that that might tempt them. And also, using grape juice makes communion more accessible to children. And children are welcome to take communion in the United Methodist Church. I understand some parents prefer to have their kids wait until they're old enough to understand it better. And if that's your choice, I respect that. I'm not saying you're wrong. But if any child comes to me and wants to take Holy Communion, I'm willing to give it to them because, again, it's one of the ways in which God's grace comes into us. And I never want to be in the position of having tried to deny God's grace to anyone who wants it. Sometimes we use the little pieces of bread. Sometimes we have you pull a chunk off of a loaf. Sometimes we use little cups of juice. Sometimes we have you dip the bread into a larger cup. Why do we do that? What difference does it make? Well, it really does not make any difference at all. It's a preference. It's a choice. It's whatever somebody prefers to do. It really does not matter that much how we take communion. What matters is that we do take communion. Because that is one of the means in which we feel God's grace in our hearts and in our lives. So when we offer communion in just a little bit here, please come. It does not matter if you don't feel worthy, because none of us are worthy. You're not worthy and neither am I. If we had to be worthy of taking communion, we never would. None of us is worthy, but each one of us is made worthy by the grace of God. And the grace of God is something we all need. We all need to feel God's Spirit in our hearts. We all need to remember the sacrifice that Jesus made for us. We all need to be grateful for that sacrifice. We all need to ask for God's forgiveness and to feel God's grace so we can be God's people living in God's world. As I've said a couple of times, I never want to be in the position of having tried to deny God's grace to anyone. And so I ask you, please, to never try to deny it to yourselves either. We're going to move now into our time of Holy Communion. And I ask that you would please all join us in that. Amen.